Welcome back, guys, to Chapter 3 of the making of Assassin's Creed, the 15th anniversary. Chapter 3 is the Kenway Dynasty. So let's look at it and see what there is to see. Okay. Assassin's Creed 3. Back when Assassin's Creed Brotherhood was still in production, Ubisoft Montreal started work on what was to be the next generation of Assassin's Creed games. This was going to be a new and super ambitious entry in the series, powered by a new iteration of Ubisoft's Anvil engine, dubbed Anvil Next. Furthermore, it was going to be set during the Revolutionary War in the United States. Not only was this a notable and turbulent period of time, perfect for the kinds of stories the developers wanted to tell in Assassin's Creed, but the setting was partly chosen to appeal to a broader audience. Compared to Assassin's Creed 2, where the brand was still somewhat novel, the third numbered entry was going to be an absolute blockbuster. The American Revolution setting was definitely a way for us to perform even better in the United States, says Assassin's Creed brand director Etienne Altener. When we pitched Assassin's Creed 2 to our American colleagues for the first time, a lot of them weren't all that enthusiastic about it. They weren't that familiar with the Italian Renaissance. But with the American Revolution, we got an immediate seal of approval. Everyone wanted us to go bigger on this one. He continues, the American Revolution was a bit more mainstream than the Italian Renaissance. As always, the protagonist of an Assassin's Creed game had to match with the historical setting. As this game would take place during the Revolutionary War, the team was really keen to have a character who sat between the warring factions of the British and Americans. Ultimately, they landed on a Native American character. When I joined, Patrice had this idea of a much more personal story for Assassin's Creed 3, says Alex Hutchinson, creative director on Assassin's Creed 3. Very early on, he was talking about how he wanted to have Quebec in the game. It was going to be the story of North America and of family. The more I thought about it, the more it became obvious that having a Native American protagonist made sense. That was incredibly exciting for us to have someone who could stand outside of the sort of cliche positions of the audience. He wasn't going to be aligned with the Redcoats, and he wasn't going to be aligned with the Patriots. He could be a character who spoke for the player and offered an external perspective, which was really exciting. When historian Maxime Durand joined the project, it wasn't clear when exactly during the American Revolution the game would be set. What was set in stone was that Assassin's Creed 3's protagonist was going to be Native American. Ubisoft just wasn't sure which tribe it was going to focus on. So we looked at all the different tribes and what happened to them, Durand says. We examined what involvement and role they played within the American Revolution, if any. We ended up landing on the, also known as the Mohawks, because they were the most relevant ones for the game's needs. They were part of a confederation located in upstate New York that had dissolved because of the American Revolution and the 7 Years' War, which happened shortly before the Revolution. They traditionally sided with the English colonies against the French ones. The internal conflicts of the American Revolution also impacted the Native American confederations. Thus, Ratontoken, also known as Connor, continuing in the franchise's naming tradition, Connor means hunter, was created. In fact, the Ubisoft team needed to work with the Mohawk Nation in order for him to be given his name. In the Mohawk tradition, you cannot pick your name, as Azier explains. You have to ask for the council to give you a name, and that name is unique. The name Ratontoken was given to us by the Mohawk Council, and it's an entirely unique name. It actually means the one who scratches at life. Creating a character that was going to follow in the footsteps of Ezio was a huge task. By the time his trilogy closed with Revelations, he was one of video games' most recognizable characters. Those were some really big shoes to fill, as Azier laughs. Coming up with a new protagonist after Ezio was almost an impossible mission. The funny thing is, at the time, I remember vividly when we were announcing new games, people were like, oh come on, not Ezio again. A lot of people were fed up with him and wanted something new. But because players spent a lifetime with him and saw him evolve, change, and grow old, replacing him was a Herculean task. The idea was that the character has to be reflective of their time period, They have to be a symbol of what's happening in the story. And therefore, when we worked on Connor, the idea was that we would showcase the struggle between father and son. The issue that Jesmond has with his father is also reflected in the issue that Connor has with his own father. Connor also served to solidify the gameplay pillars of Assassin's Creed 3. We wanted to reflect the Native American's influence in Connor's fighting style. That's why Connor has a knife and a tomahawk, Lafayette says. He's able to fight up close and personal. We also thought he'd be at least at ease in a nature setting, and probably a good hunter, so we introduced the bow. Finally, we thought it'd be really cool to offer different viewpoints to players, so Connor is super agile and able to climb trees easily. In order to give an authentic portrayal of Connor, the team turned to Native American voice actors to give life to the character. A portion of it is actually in Mohawk, Picard says. It's something that I think made the team really proud. We had Mohawk actors come in to record. The idea was to be as authentic as possible. After years of a flamboyant character like Ezio, opinion within the Assassin's Creed audience was somewhat divided when it came to Connor. Some people loved him, as Azia says, but others had an issue with him because they felt he was a bit too dark, a bit too driven. Living history. During the development of Assassin's Creed 3, Maxime Durand joined the Ubisoft staff full-time as the in-house historian. He was aided in his work for this project by outside consultants. While Durand had worked on Revelations, this was the project he was hired for. It was never stated that it was going to be the most accurate game. However, because they hired me to be on the team as an in-house historian, I think they wanted to do justice to the American Revolution time period, Durand explains. That didn't necessarily mean glorifying it, but rather treating it with respect. It's most definitely the game that fits closest to the real historical track. Lafayette adds, from a historical perspective, the American Revolution is probably one of the richest, but also one of the toughest time periods to sit a game in. One of your biggest markets, the US, has been learning about this era since they started school. It's such a pivotal moment of history, and it's so heavily documented that you cannot really steer away from or invent anything. It's very, very precise. Whereas in the Ezio trilogy, the Ubisoft Montreal team had started to bring in real characters for our protagonists to interact with, such as Leonardo da Vinci, Assassin's Creed 3 went much harder on the history of the period. In fact, Connor was present for many of the pivotal events of the American Revolution. We actively witnessed and participated in the Boston Tea Party in Boston Harbor in the game. We tried to explain why this event was important, Durand says. Players can also witness the famous ride made by Paul Revere, as well as the burning of the city of New York. But in addition to the famous events of the time period, Durand's expertise allowed the studio to recreate aspects of the era that were not as well known. I don't think people can easily imagine what North America looked like in the 18th century, he says. One of the greatest opportunities was to be able to immerse players in a believable visual rendering of the northern colonies during that time period. Most of the landmarks have disappeared. If we just look at the city of New York, there are only one or two buildings from the time era that are still standing. The city has changed quite a bit except for its layout. Durand was also vital in helping unearth the Native American story of the time period. The communities work hand in hand with Ubisoft through a respectful collaborative process. The American Revolution is very well documented from the American and British perspective, Bergeron says. From a mission design director's or writer's point of view, that information was pretty easy to come by. The thing that was really hard for us to find was the Native American perspective. That viewpoint is not as well documented because, in general, the Native American population has been spurned in the past, both in how they're treated and how they're portrayed. As a result, they tend to be a bit more reserved when it comes to sharing that type of information. From the outset, it was a little harder to get that perspective, but having Maxime was good in that sense because he was able to find the right consultants for us to talk to and get the information from. For the development team, going into the history of a setting wasn't limited to just using the services of the in-house historian. The team was developing the game in the basement of the studio, Altair Elwiner says. I remember entering the basement and there were old costumes from the time period everywhere. I think that was the first time that the group was so immersed in the setting, maybe because it was slightly easier to find these items compared to the Renaissance. It was the first time where I felt that the team was living in the period. There were tomahawks and weapons from the American Revolution displayed in the studio. In fact, the crew generally think that they follow the events of the American Revolution too closely. They have even given this phenomenon its own name. It's the Forrest Gump effect, Duran laughs. After Assassin's Creed 3, we tried to stay away from being too close to the real historical track. Assassin's Creed 3 offered a truthful recreation of the American Revolution's key events and impacts, such as the displacement of Native American populations and the complexity of its geopolitics. But staying too close to actual events resulted in fewer opportunities for level design, because everything you did, no matter what you did, would always have to coincide with what happened in the American Revolution. The personal motivations of the Templars and the Assassins had to match with those of the real historical characters and the real events. The targets that Connor was hunting down were real people whose deaths are documented and definitive. Historical records list where they died and when. As always, the team had to weave its Assassin's Creed revisionist history into factual events. The game's main bad guy, Lee, died in a pub by himself, Lefire says. So how do you craft an interesting finale with a villain who will ultimately die in a pub? Obviously, you end up fighting and poisoning him, so he dies in the pub as planned. But in our telling of it, there's an epic chase that happened first. It was a very fun but challenging production because of that. America at the time of the Revolution presented something of a challenge for the development team because it wasn't very metropolitan compared to, say, Renaissance Italy. The revolutionary setting in America is a pretty dull place for most traditional video games, Hutchinson says. There were no tall buildings and no really big cities. The architecture was pretty mediocre. It was an amazing point in history, but it wasn't necessarily a fun setting. Still, we liked the idea of that challenge. A whole new world. Up until now, Assassin's Creed games had been very urban-centric. There were areas outside of cities that the player could explore, but these weren't very fleshed out. In fact, with prior Assassin's Creed games, the development had a rule that the protagonist could interact with human architecture, but not organic structures in the natural world. By contrast, the team making Assassin's Creed 3 labored to create an actual living world. This was done out of necessity given the time period the game was set in. The cities at that time couldn't have supported the density of experience and the missions that we wanted to put together, Hutchinson explains. America at the time was the water and the land as well as the cities. To be honest with the setting, we had to expand it to include those things. He continues, there were still some beautiful buildings, but there weren't too many landmarks. We realized that maybe one way to tackle that problem was to engage with the natural world. We did free running in trees and uneven surfaces. That felt like the opportunity for us. Instead of looking at how we could take the Assassin's Creed formula verbatim from an urban setting to what counted as an urban setting in America. What opportunities existed? What did the setting give us? What it gave us was trees, mountains, and cities, and cliffs, as well as some cities. We looked at it as more of an opportunity rather than trying to squash the formula into colonial America. This came with its fair share of challenges, however. Building a city is tough, but at least it's somewhat logical. The wilderness with flora and fauna is not only hard to make, but also difficult to make feel organic. It was a lot of work, Hutchinson laughs. We had to challenge the navigation team to take on areas that they hadn't before. The beauty of cities and buildings is that they're quite rigidly constructed. They have rules and patterns that we could follow, which helped with the engineering. By contrast, the natural world is made up of much more arbitrary shapes, with an array of angles, branches, and all these things. Bergeron adds, we spent a lot of time asking, what does a gameplay forest mean for the brand? How do you build a tree that is fun to navigate, but doesn't look like a coat rack? It still needs to resemble an organic and natural tree, something that grew with the laws of nature, and not something orchestrated by the laws of man. We eventually found some formulas, but never enough that we could propagate them across the entire world, sadly. As with the original Assassin's Creed, and the Sands of Time before it, the team once again had to contend with the idea of readability. They had to come up with a method of telling players what they could and couldn't interact with. Now we can make the player interact with anything, but it doesn't mean that they understand that they should interact with things, or that they can see those paths, Bergeron explains. The foundation of the brand was Prince of Persia, and games that had an orchestrated path where the players can see where to go and reverse engineer a plan on how to navigate it. All of that goes out the window when you're talking about organic architecture, so it took us a while to wrap our heads around that, and eventually we found our formula on how to do that. The team had to spend a lot of time figuring out how to recreate parts of the world that felt organic. They also had to work out how to have Connor move through these spaces in a natural way. It was such a huge technical change when it came to the way the character moved around the world, Puel says. At the time, this was based on metrics. This system called rational level design, all based on very precise metrics. When you go into the world outside of cities, it's much harder to do that because things have to be very organic, and there are no metrics between trees to let the game know if the player can jump from branch to branch. But we had to recreate that new world. It was a huge technical change. There was a vast ambition for this game where we had 3 years of development. We had an amazing team, and we took a very big bite with this one. Not only was building an organic world that actually felt natural challenging, but the team also needed to fill this space. Trying to find the density of experience that made being in that world fun was also challenging, Hutchinson says, especially in a game like Assassin's Creed, where you're predominantly on foot. People move at around 6 meters a second at most. The natural world in America is vast, so we had the horse and we had fast travel as well. But making sure that there was enough to see and do was a challenge. So we introduced hunting. Plus, we introduced naval combat to support the fantasy of life on the sea. I'm just really proud of the huge volume of new stuff that we jammed into Assassin's Creed 3. Bergeron adds, it's mainly a challenge on pure level design aspects. When you're talking about world design and finding ways to occupy the player, it's not that hard on the mission design side. We just had that we wanted to tell in this environment. Then we do some location scouting and find the right environment for the stories. For instance, we knew that we had to do reverse ride at some point. We had an idea of how that was going to go down. From there, we talked with the world designers and told them what we needed. We had to have a number of mountain villages spread out in a certain way so that there were travel moments during which Paul Revere and Connor could talk. On the mission design side, that was easy enough. It was the responsibility of the world design side to strike the perfect balance of having enough interactions, but not so many interactions that it doesn't feel like a forest anymore. There's a density that is expected when it comes to a city, as opposed to farmland or the boonies, where there's a scarcity or sparsity in the way that it's laid out that is expected. While the world was much more sprawling and far less urban, on the design side of things, the team still approached design with cities in mind. That was something they would change later in the franchise, but at the time they had to fill the wilderness. We had to ask ourselves what made sense to have in the forest, considering what we had at the time, Bergeron says. We focused on activities such as hunting, as well as having patrols going through the forest. We also had cargo deliveries, which meant there were carts that could be ambushed. There were some forts too. Frontier forts looked more like a traditional log cabin rather than a traditional stone or brick fort, but it still needed to feel as if you were out in the forest. While Montreal led work on Assassin's Creed 3, other studios were brought in to help out on various aspects of the game. Quebec, for example, worked on the Homestead, a feature that continued what Assassin's Creed 2 started, having a home for the game's protagonist. One of the things that I wanted to accomplish in Assassin's Creed 3 through the Homestead was to flesh out our characters and give them more screen time, says Marc Alexis Cote, who is the game director for Ubisoft Quebec. They weren't just about killing people, they had a life as well. The Homestead was there to really flesh out the pitch and the personality of Connor. What I found interesting in retrospect is that people who played the Homestead had a very different appreciation of Assassin's Creed 3 and of Connor, compared with people who just ignored this part of the game. Let It Snow. Given that the Canadian studio is creating an open-world game on the brand new iteration of its game engine, Anvil Next, it made sense to introduce weather into the world of Assassin's Creed. Specifically, the developers decided to implement snow. Featuring weather, especially snow, had become popular within AAA games at the time, but in most cases, these were linear titles and not sprawling open worlds. It's much easier to do things in a scripted or linear level than it is in an open world, Hutchinson says. The reason we wanted to include the snow is because we live in Quebec. It gets down to around negative 35 degrees Celsius. It felt very disingenuous to make a game about North America and not point out that it gets pretty cold here. I felt like we had to be true to our setting. Azazia adds, in the very first presentation that Hutchinson and the team gave about Assassin's Creed 3, they said, we're in Montreal. If there's one thing we know, it's snow. This was a feature we needed in our game. They had worked so hard to make this really believable, working snow. It was a huge leap forward in terms of animation and rendering techniques. Weather mechanics, such as snow, weren't present just to show off the technical proficiency of the development team, or to highlight just how cold North America can be. We wanted weather, but we also wanted it to mean something in gameplay, Bergeron says. Snow would slow you down when you walked through it, which gave the player an incentive to use the branches when they were in the forest so as not to be slowed down. You also leave tracks in the snow, which can then be a distraction for enemies who could follow your footprints in the snow to try and find you. We figured that something like blizzards and fog would reduce the ability of both sides to detect each other. By this point, the Ubisoft teams in Montreal and Singapore have been collaborating on Assassin's Creed for quite some time. With the third numbered entry in the series, the two work closer together, in part thanks to a shared passion of franchise executive producer Sébastien Puel and Singapore managing director Olivier de Rotellier. They were both into ships, Louis laughs, and they asked whether the idea of ship and naval gameplay was something that could fit in the brand. They asked if we could make a pirate game and asked us to explore the concept a bit. So the Singapore team did just that. A number of coders who had been working on Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Phantoms had recently become available, so they headed over to Montreal for 4 to 6 weeks in order to prototype what naval gameplay could look like. They spent some time creating a prototype of what a naval battlefield could feel like, Louis says. It was very rough, graphically speaking, but the gameplay loop was there. People tried it and said it was really cool and could be super interesting. The American Revolution setting meant that introducing naval gameplay was a nice fit. This period had a number of sea conflicts, such as the Battle of the Chesapeake, but as was the case with a lot of new features that were to be introduced into Assassin's Creed, outside of the core gameplay loop, naval gameplay was designed to be highly cuttable. Assassin's Creed 3 could easily have shipped without the naval missions and still have been a very large and compelling experience, Louis admits. I think the pressure was slightly reduced. It didn't have to be part of that game, but the team knew they had something interesting. While the Assassin's Creed franchise had introduced new forms of gameplay over its history, at the time naval was definitely the biggest leap from the core tenets of the franchise. Making this fit within the series was a tricky thing to get right. It was extremely difficult because we tried to look at what the pillars of the brand are, Louis explains. It's stealth, it's exploration, it's about reaching high points. Those things are really hard to do. We realized that the assassin needs to be at the heart of everything. The camera angle we used for naval gameplay, for example, was the subject of a lot of discussion. Did we want to go with a top-down view like Sid Meier's Pirates, which would have been good for a strategic battle, or did we want to stay on the assassin's shoulder to be true to the brand? Of course we went for the latter. That in itself was a big decision and guided a lot of the other decisions. The game is action-based, so it makes sense that you're at the wheel. You are shouting orders to your crew to shoot cannons. Let's start with that. We can have two sides shooting cannons at each other, and wind plays a factor in that, of course. It was so different from what we had built before. As with anything involving new tech, the tools required to actually make the content were ready quite late in development. But when they started playtesting, Ubisoft Singapore knew they were onto something. At the time, no mission had ever received such a high rating in the franchise's history as the first naval missions we tested, Louis says. The playtest score was out of this world. It was actually a really boring mission, in a way. It was more or less a tutorial showing players how to shoot, how to navigate. But because it was the first time people were doing it, it looked amazing and it felt great. It wasn't very deep or rich as a mission on its own compared to the rest. However, because it was the first time players had ever experienced something like this in the brand, the ratings were just really good. It was funny. Prior to this test, our game director said the naval mission was boring and that we needed to improve it. Then the playtest results came back, literally 5 out of 5, and the game director said, it's fine, we can leave it. Obviously, the naval component was a great success, and we already knew based on playtest results that it was something that had hooked players. The fact that, in-game, the naval missions were separate from the open world gave the Singapore team a great deal of freedom. They could go bigger and better and more impressive with those segments. We didn't have to worry about the open world constraints, Louis says. We could have beautiful visual effects and audio. Part of this was having a dynamic and interesting ocean. It wasn't enough to just have water. The sea needed to be a beast that could change on a whim, an element which played an active role in naval engagements. You often build mandates based on the people you have, and one of the experts we had was technical director George Torres, Louis explains. He built the ocean simulation and then unlocked so much more. Just having that and having ships floating on it created such a dynamic game space. Depending on the angle of the waves, your cannons were going to either shoot way up into the sky or hit the water. It was all part of the ocean simulation, and it would change again completely. It was a great tool for designers to play with because you can start with calm weather and then have a storm come in and change the experience entirely. As a level designer, you didn't have to do much. You could just tell the player to sail through a particular strait and then have a storm come in and that raised the wind from Beaufort 2 to Beaufort 7. For Assassin's Creed 3, Ubisoft's Annecy studio once again delivered the multiplayer experience. Dubbed Wolfpack, this was a cooperative mode that saw 4 players teaming up to fight against waves of enemies. As with many aspects of the now annual Assassin's Creed series, this was something that the crew had tried to implement with Revelations, but which they hadn't been able to get right. We wanted to do a co-op experience for Revelations, Grandjean explains. We worked on a game mode called Battle for Rhodes, which would have been a 4-player cooperative mode that felt like a small campaign. We managed to get it working, but had some doubts about how well it would perform. We spent about 3 months on this, but stopped because it was just too complicated. There were also concerns about performance and how big the world was, how NPCs were managed, and so on, so we ceased working on it. But in true Assassin's Creed fashion, what the team couldn't fully deliver in 1 year was absolutely attainable in the next. Deciding to go for co-op in Assassin's Creed 3 was partly to offer a middle ground for an audience that was primarily playing these games to experience a single-player narrative. We wanted to have this co-op version of the game, Grandjean explains. At the time, I was a content director, and we pushed the game director really hard to include the co-op mode, because we felt that it was something that would attract more solo players to the game. The issue was that, on the one hand, we were setting a solo experience to an audience that loved solo narrative experiences. On the other hand, we were also selling a very fast-paced, stressful multiplayer game to that same audience. The co-op feature was a way to try to make them more comfortable with an online game. We also felt that co-op modes were a strong proposal and were super fun to play. Given how much work has gone into souping up the Anvil game engine for Assassin's Creed multiplayer, the Annecy team was still using this tech to power the co-op portion of the game for Assassin's Creed 3. The main game had used the new and improved Anvil Next tech, but the Annecy studio was able to squeeze everything they could out of the engine. At the start of development, we were told that we'd probably look outdated visually compared to the rest of the game, Grandjean laughs. But when the game was released, some reviewers praised Anvil Next as being beautiful, especially in the multiplayer sections. This was partly because Anvil Next was having to manage aspects like lighting across a huge world, while the multiplayer portions of the game were far more confined. The team had also started to make the multiplayer mode in Assassin's Creed 3 closer to the single-player portions. This included the fake advertisements with cutscenes to frame what was taking place within this part of the game. We came up with this idea that the multiplayer would be this disc literally made by Abstergo that shipped with the game, Yohalam explains. I ran with that. This idea that this is a product that's shipped by them. Coming up with all of the videos for their fake product advertisements was very fun. This was before Black Mirror, so it's amusing. That show explored a lot of the same ideas that we had done with Revelations' multiplayer mode and the type of products that Abstergo made. A Death in the Family. As well as telling the story of the American Revolution and of Connor, Assassin's Creed 3 had some pretty heavy narrative decisions to make when it came to the franchise's modern-day components. The team had to decide whether the present-day protagonist, Desmond, had to go. At the brand level, there were some pretty intense discussions with the Assassin's Creed 3 team about the fact that we had to end Desmond's story. Wisden remembers. We needed to free the franchise. Desmond was instrumental and very important at the start because he was part of the glue that held together different games. He created this feeling of consistency between episodes, no matter what time period a title was taking place in. Third Crusade, no problem. It was actually Desmond's story. Then we moved it to the Italian Renaissance. That was fine. It was Desmond's story. This was then repeated with the American Revolution. From the start, the team had wanted Assassin's Creed to be a franchise, one which could be the subject of books, graphic novels, and films. While the framing device of Desmond worked nicely at the beginning, it had started to limit what Ubisoft could do with the franchise. We were expanding the franchise, bringing new characters to the table, Guiston says. We had started to feel constrained. If all the transmedia was referring to and based on Desmond, we would have been limited in the long run, in the long term. The Assassin's Creed franchise had been building toward a big world-ending event in 2012, since its inception back in 2007. At the start, 2012 felt like a long time in the future. Then, all of a sudden, we had reached 2012, Guiston says. The solution was really to say that from 2012, the real world had caught up with the modern-day story with Desmond, Abstergo, and so on. From there, we have merged the two. The present day of the game is our actual present day. Desmond's sacrifice saved the human race in Assassin's Creed 3 and allowed the franchise to continue for many years to come. Before launch, hype for this game was at an all-time high. In October 2012, Ubisoft had said that it was the most preferred title. It was the most pre-ordered title to date, and that the franchise as a whole had shipped 40 million copies. Within a week of release, Ubisoft estimated that Assassin's Creed 3 had sold 3.5 million copies, double that of its predecessor Revelations. To put it lightly, the game was an absolute blockbuster. As always, Ubisoft wanted to build upon the established mechanics for its next entry in the franchise. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. It probably won't come as a shock that Black Flag emerged because of the quality of naval gameplay in Assassin's Creed 3. Having seen some of this in production, the Ubisoft marketing team said that it made total sense to create a pirate game. Sebastian turned to me and asked me how we fit a pirate game within the Assassin's Creed franchise. Guiston laughs. This project initially began as a series of expansions for Assassin's Creed 3, led by the Montreal studio. At the time, the Singapore studio was still relatively young and therefore couldn't shoulder an entire project, but the Revelations team was available after that game had shipped. The core naval gameplay went to Montreal, Louis says. It was a wise decision too, because otherwise the director was in Montreal and the programmers were in Singapore. It's a 12-hour time difference. Montreal had a bigger programming team anyway. With this in mind, Guiston started trying to square the circle that was fitting a pirate fantasy into the Assassin's Creed series. Assassins and pirates, these are two different things, but to me it was not an issue, he says. Being an assassin is more of a philosophy. It's about values that you carry. The conflict between the Templars and the Brotherhood, control versus free will, is a never-ending conflict. That is one of the strengths of the franchise. I felt that there was no reason why you couldn't talk about this in the context of the Age of Pirates. For Black Flag, the Montreal team created the character of Edward Kenway, the grandfather of Assassin's Creed 3's Connor. At the time, he was unique in terms of protagonists in the franchise, not least because he only becomes an assassin right at the end of the game. Edward is never an assassin during Black Flag, Guiston says. At the end of the game, he welcomes his daughter, goes back to England, and stops being a pirate. He's basically a pirate that was catapulted almost against his will in this never-ending war between assassins and Templars. We had Edward start off as a young, impetuous, adventurous, and happy with his pirate life. That's the fantasy that people have about pirates. We had to fulfill for the players, who wanted to go to these paradisic islands and travel around on ships with this guy who thinks that being free means having no rules. Throughout Black Flag's narrative, however, this idea is tested. The dream of total freedom disintegrates into having nothing. You realize that when you follow this path, you cannot build anything, Guiston says. Edward has lost all his friends because being a pirate wasn't a long-term lifestyle. At some point, he realizes that this life is going nowhere. His people are starving. It's not fun to be a pirate. So then the opportunity arises to join either the Assassins or the Templars. The former is saying that you can have free will with only a few rules to follow, which will allow you to grow and build things, while the Templars think that they need to tell you what to do for your own good. In trying to find some touchstones for who Edward would be, the team looked forward some more modern sources. These included Star Wars infamous space pirate Han Solo and Bodhi from the 1991 classic film Point Break. When you look at Point Break, they're basically contemporary pirates, Guisden says. What are they doing? They are robbing banks for money to go surfing and partying on the beach and drinking around fires. If it was really this period of being a little bit at the edge of society saying, we are living our good life, and when we need to, we go rob some stuff, and it's okay. And yeah, Patrick Swayze as Bodhi was a reference actually. Lacoste adds, Edward was just a bit of a clumsy, reckless guy. That obviously contrasts with what you might expect from an assassin. It made this character so uniquely interesting because he was still a pirate. Even when he gets to be an assassin, in my mind, he is still a pirate. A Pirate's Life. For Black Flag, the team set about researching the real world of pirates, including texts like A General History of the Pirates and the Republic of Pirates. As with all historical settings, the aim was for authenticity. As we honed in on the narrative and gameplay experience, we began to reach out to experts in their respective fields to get more precision on certain topics and to make sure we always had someone who was responsive to our more detailed questions, McDevitt says. For my part, I worked with his author and journalist, Colin Woodard, who was instrumental in reviewing my scripts and answering whatever questions I had while writing that game. The artists and designers talked with Mike Loades about weaponry, and the audio team employed the help of historians and musicians who could make our sea shanties come to life. The image we have in our minds when we think about these rogues of the great wide ocean is largely derived from a handful of sources, namely Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. In reality, there weren't many of the typical trappings of the pirate stories we are used to in film and TV. Darby was very vocal and adamant on this point, Guisden says. All this peg leg, parrot on the shoulder, and so on came from Treasure Island. That was amplified by Hollywood and contemporary pop culture. So we told ourselves, no peg leg, no parrot. At some point during game development, we made t-shirts for the team that said, no hooks, no parrots, no eye patches. We were bringing the pirate reality, not the pirate fantasy. It's not 100% true, because you want to find some treasure and so on. But when you look at this story, it's not super lighthearted. It's all set under a blue sky, but it was not fun to be a pirate. All this being said, during development, the team listed elements from the pirate fantasy that they wanted to include within Black Flag. We looked at all the moments that we felt were representative of a pirate experience, Guisden says. We needed a storm. We had to shipwreck the player. We needed them to wake up on the shore of a desert island. We had to have lost temples in the jungle, as well as an underwater sequence. This development was just incredible. I still have people coming to me saying it was their best project. Translating the reality of pirate life to a mass-market audience of one of the most mainstream game franchises at the time was not easy by any means. We were making a very mainstream game for a very large audience. The audience of Assassin's Creed can go as young as 17 because it's rated M for mature, but can go as high as people in their 30s and 40s, McDevitt says. We wanted to appeal to a broad group, so we needed to acknowledge that there was a natural tendency for people to shy away from the more unsavory elements of a story, especially things like the slave trade and sugar trade at that point in time, as well as the fact that a lot of pirates were just straight-up criminals with no redeeming features. Others were a bit more revolutionary in their thinking. Puel adds, we transformed piracy and pirates into a pure fantasy. For thousands of people at the time, this was an actual reality. It had geostrategic implications in terms of the gold, going from South America to Europe. There were a lot of incredible stories that happened. There was the center of the world at that time. That's where the battles were waged. It had historical significance. And we wanted to look at the real history of pirates. Of course, it's a game. And of course we had heroes. That's not to say that history didn't conflict with what the design team wanted to do with Black Flag. Pirates, for instance, never attacked the natives of Britain, Spain, and France, McDevitt explains. Doing so would have been absolutely reckless. They would have been horribly outgunned. Pirates almost exclusively focused on robbing merchants and civilians, and they almost never got into fights. They would never sink ships. They rarely fired their guns or killed people. They would just scare the crap out of people, board their ship, threaten them, steal all their stuff, and then set them adrift. But it would have been very hard to figure out how to make a game where your primary motivation is frightening people. What would it have meant to sail alongside somebody and scare them? So of course, the game design loop was, let's attack. Let's just get into lots of combat, swashbuckling combat, sword fights, and gunplay. But we can't do it against civilians because that would be unsavory, so let's do it against the Navy. Pule adds, you learn a lot about pirates playing this game. If you only watch film and TV, you don't know anything about piracy. There is so much real history injected into this game. I remember there was some resistance when we first said this would be an Assassin's Creed about pirates. People thought it was going to be fantasy, because they associate pirates with a fantasy world. But our depiction of pirates would be a harsh, concrete, real one, versus the image of pirates created by pop culture in Hollywood. The fact that people had been more familiar with the fantastical elements of piracy was in part one of the reasons why some people at Ubisoft have been leaning toward having Black Flag be a side story instead of the next chapter of the main Assassin's Creed narrative. I mean, people, we were afraid of that perception of fantasy, Peel adds, but at some point in the production we had the courage to say that we were including a fascinating piece of human history. In the beginning, we were a bit afraid of that, but when we were building the game, we realized it was truly interesting assassin story. Though the pirate fantasy was a key aspect of Black Flag, for Gleasden it was critical that this would still be an Assassin's Creed game at its core. These two aspects needed to be entirely interlinked. The message was we were doing one game, a pirate Assassin's Creed game, he explains. My direction was crystal clear. I didn't want an Assassin's Creed game on land and a pirate game at sea. Being as seamless as possible was important. The gameplay loops we created resulted in this coherence. For example, you would do things on land that would benefit you at sea. You collected shanties when doing assassin stuff on land, like parkouring. Those would then become your pirate radio when you were on the Jackdaw. And while at sea, you pillaged ships which would benefit you on land because you could invest what you had obtained. The dev team who had previously worked on Assassin's Creed Revelations was used to creating urban settings, such as that title's Constantinople. While the series had already experimented with more natural worlds that were less focused on cities with Assassin's Creed 3's Frontier, a vast and open ocean was an altogether dissimilar prospect. When I first started to play the game, I realized the potential for adventure, as Azia says. Until now, Assassin's Creed games had hubs and cities. You're either having fun in the hub or in a city-based environment. With Black Flag, the map isn't a couple of cities with a hub. It's literally a world. The player can go wherever they want, and it's going to be a big adventure. That was a super different beast to other Assassin's Creed games. The team wanted Black Flag to be seamless. You could sail up to an island, jump off your boat, and explore it. Everything was going to be connected. It was very different to what we were used to. Much like how an enjoyable pirate fantasy didn't quite line up with the reality of that point in history, the team had to come up with some creative ways to include more iconic, albeit anachronistic, elements of Black Flag's Caribbean setting. Anachronistic. We went to Havana and took a lot of photos, Lacoste says. We knew that during the period we were setting Black Flag in. For instance, the cathedral wouldn't have been there yet, but we decided to play with the potential animus glitches and feature the iconic elements people would expect to see when they go to the Caribbean and to Cuba. For instance, we had to recreate certain places that these days are filled with hotels and concrete and contain no hint of their pirate past. So we worked it by looking at references, engravings, and also by making things using our imagination. What would the pirate haven in Nassau look like? We did the same for Kingston. We were inspired by things like references of houses from the 18th century and blueprints of the city, but there was a lot of freedom for sure. With Black Flag, the multiplayer Wolfpack mode from Assassin's Creed 3 returned. As before, this was built by Ubisoft's team in Annecy, and had primarily been created on the Anvil engine that the team had souped up for Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, with one big improvement. We borrowed the rendering part of the single-player game's engine, Grandjohn says, so the lighting in multiplayer mode is much better, and we had better performance. Whether or not the Annecy team knew that Black Flag would be the last entry in the Assassin's Creed franchise to include a competitive multiplayer mode, as of the time of this writing, it's safe to say that the studio was incredibly confident in their ability to deliver a fun and interesting experience. Given the game's setting, Annecy decided to include a wider range of characters. We went a bit wild with the characters on Black Flag. We could have more outlandish people because it was the age of piracy, Grandjohn explains. It was a good opportunity. Annecy also gave players a huge amount of freedom with Black Flag's multiplayer component with the option to create custom games. The biggest innovation with the custom game nodes, Grengen says. You could share these with your friends in the community. With Black Flag, you can have a game mode where you're only playing with guns. You can have a match where only kills are counted and the player's approach is not. You can change everything. There's 200 parameters that you can tweak on the game mode generator. It was super powerful, and it meant that the player could create a completely different game if they wanted to. An Assassin's Creed story. During development, Black Flag was codenamed Golden Age, but as work continued on the project, there was an internal debate about what the game was going to be called upon release. At one point, Black Flag wasn't even meant to be a mainline Assassin's Creed title. It was said to be called Black Flag: An Assassin's Creed Story. It could have been a game set in the universe of Assassin's Creed, but would not have been an Assassin's Creed game, as AZ explains, because you weren't playing as an assassin for pretty much the whole game. Figuring out how to position the game was vexingly complicated. Our games are supposed to be either numbered or have a unique name. Black Flag is the only game in the whole series that has both a number and a name. It's Assassin's Creed 4, Black Flag, because as developers working on the brand, we were okay with the fact that we could say that Black Flag is a game set in the Assassin's Creed universe without necessarily sharing the Assassin's Creed title. After Assassin's Creed 3 and the death of series protagonist Desmond, Ubisoft had a lot more freedom when it came to presenting the framing of its games. Before then, the Animus would only allow people to relive someone's memories in the game if they were a direct descendant of that person. We said that the Animus had been upgraded and developed so much that now anybody could relive the title of anybody else, relive the life of anybody else. Guisden says, that gave us far more freedom, narratively speaking, at the franchise level because it allowed us to justify anybody going anywhere. This was very important because at the time we had the movie in the making, several games in parallel production, and all the comics that were being developed. We needed this narrative freedom. This had all been thought over, and it made sense to once again make the franchise evolve without breaking it. The present-day setting of Black Flag was set in the entertainment division of Abstergo, aka the Templars, with the events of the game being framed as a game being created by the company. This concept actually had its roots within another Assassin's Creed project. The Abstergo entertainment concept for Black Flag originated with an earlier game, Assassin's Creed Liberation, McDevitt says. We loved the idea that Abstergo Industries would have an entertainment division. We felt it would provide a nice change of pace from the modern days format used in the previous 5 games. This was also inspired by Guisden's work on the transmedia side of things for the Assassin's Creed brand. This present-day Abstergo Entertainment was the opportunity for us to say that this was the first time that the present-day character wasn't genetically linked to the character from the past, Guisden says. Being set in a Montreal-based game studio, it's perhaps not surprising that the Abstergo Entertainment contemporary segments were also intensely self-referential. Not only was it fun for the team to make fun of themselves and games development, but it was also an opportunity to mess with players. We teased about potential developments. There were things like a PowerPoint talking about possible kinds of characters to explore, Guisden laughs. We were literally playing with the fans in the community about where we'd be going next. We also had this trailer, an actual Hollywood-style trailer, with a summer blockbuster-style voiceover, but using our real in-game stuff. We worked in it in the very early release just to have fun. This is cool content to produce because it's not that hard, and it's always fun to laugh a bit about ourselves and to play with the content that we were making. Bridging the gap. Black Flag was pioneering in many ways, and it was also the first entry in the franchise to not only launch on the new PlayStation 4 and Xbox One consoles, but also on this older PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. This introduced some technical questions. For one, the team wanted an experience that was great on all platforms, but the newer hardware was clearly capable of more impressive graphics and had more horsepower. When we arrive at the end of a generation on one console, we usually try to push for the best that console can do, Lacoste says. Black Flag looked good on the PS3, but it definitely looked better on the PlayStation 4. But we benchmarked how the game would look based on the PS3. We had a dedicated team for scaling up Black Flag to the new consoles, and I worked closely with them to make sure that the art direction was consistent across all machines. Some people came in and said that we should use a new system for doing shadows or for atmospherics and fog, but that would have completely changed the art direction. We'd have to rethink lighting in every single part of the world. This wouldn't have worked if we had wanted to scale the production. I wanted to have a solution that would scale the quality we had, but which would have kept all the intended graphics on the current platform. For instance, vegetation textures and lighting would have looked better on the next-gen machines, but we had to make sure that the game would still be beautiful on the current consoles. Since its release, Black Flag has sold more than 11 million copies. The game earned an overwhelmingly positive response, both from critics and from consumers, due to its fresh take on the Assassin's Creed franchise. The sailing aspect of the series was a huge boon for Ubisoft, and wasn't something that the firm wanted to give up on just yet. Assassin's Creed 3: The Tyranny of King Washington. After Assassin's Creed 3's release, Ubisoft released 2 pieces of single-player DLC for it, the most notable of which was probably The Tyranny of King Washington by the company's Quebec studio. There were a lot of questions about what we could do for DLC back then, Cote explains. I saw an opportunity for growth there for both the Quebec studio and for the franchise if we invested more into DLC. I thought we had a chance to do better storytelling and not just rehash stuff that the player had already done in the original game. Often when I'm done reading a book, I'd love to just keep on reading and see what happens with the characters afterward. That feeling is what I wanted to accomplish. Then we pitched something completely fantastic, which is what if George Washington had taken the apple of Eden for himself, embraced absolute power, and became a tyrant. The DLC is effectively a dream sequence shared by Connor and Washington, which, in the history of Assassin's Creed, ultimately leads to some hugely important outcomes. Washington comes to realize that ultimate absolute power is the worst thing, Cote says. As a result, he ends up crafting the Constitution of the United States so that no one can have absolute power. The fact that this was a dream and therefore outside the realms of reality and realism meant that the Quebec studio could have a bit more fun with gameplay. As opposed to the main Assassin's Creed 3 story, it could be far more experimental and fantastical. You can see us flexing some of the muscles back from Prince of Persia when we were working on more exotic gameplay, Cote says. We played with stealth, making Connor disappear, with the wolf power, and started dabbling around with him being able to fly. That was one of the best projects I've worked on. It was very, very fun. Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation. Back in 2006, Ubisoft set up a studio in Sofia, Bulgaria, and for the first few years of its existence, the developer specialized in games for handheld consoles, such as Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Shadow Wars for Nintendo 3DS and DS, and Sony PSP title Chessmaster: The Art of Learning. Having proved itself as a capable group for portable projects, Ubisoft Sofia was approached in 2010 to work on an Assassin's Creed title for Sony's upcoming PlayStation Vita handheld console. Liberation was also set in America, though while Assassin's Creed 3 primarily took place in the north of the continent, this Vita title was set in the city of New Orleans, as well as the marshy Louisiana bayous. It's also the first Assassin's Creed title to feature a female protagonist, Aveline de Grand Prairie. It was a challenge for us to create a very believable character for this time period, which is core to the brand itself, Ubisoft Sofia creative director Mikhail Lozanov says, and I believe we created a truly cool character. She's a total badass, absolutely. So we're very proud of this work. Though it was coming to a portable machine, this title, what would become Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, was to be built on the same Anvil Next game engine that powered Assassin's Creed 3. Home consoles and portable machines are different for a number of reasons, but perhaps the most important factor for developers is energy efficiency. Home consoles are plugged into the main power, so they have a constant supply of power, whereas handheld machines tend to run on batteries, so they have to be much more energy efficient. Getting an engine primarily designed for PC and console to power a title on PlayStation Vita was a challenge, but one that Sofia was capable of handling. We had the right people, and with some clever optimizations we made it work, Lozanov says. It was basically the same editor, the same engine, and the rendering was tight. The Vita was very capable back then compared to what else was on the market. Pulads, the team in Sofia working on this game, were magicians. They made things run that we thought were impossible to run on a Vita. Technically, it was a real achievement. But as is frequently the case with game development, a lot of the process is smoke and mirrors. Studios have to come up with rather creative solutions to create something that looks good to players. We had a raft in the bayou in Liberation. It's presented as though it's Aveline who was navigating the raft, but it was actually a crocodile underneath that was driving the raft, Lozanov explains. The engine believes that this is a crocodile. Sometimes we had bugs where this raft was eating people, and so on. Assassin's Creed Rogue. While Black Flag launched across both the old and new console generations, it wasn't possible to continue serving both these audiences with the same games in the long term. To do so would have been to hold the Assassin's Creed franchise back due to the lower power of the older machines. There was an Assassin's Creed game in the works for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, Unity, but Ubisoft also wanted to bring a new release to the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 at the same time. Dubbed Rogue, this would build upon the naval gameplay formula established in Assassin's Creed 3 and Black Flag. The project was being led by Ubisoft Sofia, with work being shared with Singapore. Rogue is something of a unique entry in the Assassin's Creed franchise. Previous games had predominantly seen players taking on the role of one of the titular assassins, with the exception of Black Flag, but this entry in the series saw players cast as a Templar. We really wanted to explore the gray area between the Assassins and the Templars, Mikhail Lozanov says. So far, everything had been pretty black and white, at least in the games. Our desire to explore the gray area was driven by the fact that Assassins and Templars are both morally gray. It's not as simple as one group is evil and the other is good. Their members are humans, after all, and they have this nuance in their characters, and nuance in how they make decisions. They have some personality traits as well, and we wanted to explore this. I strongly believe that when we have such characters, they are more relatable, because they're closer to the players, who are humans and who play these games. The other side. The protagonist of this game was in fact an assassin turned Templar, Shay Cormac, someone who can see the virtues and shortcomings of both factions and their philosophies. Having Rogue's hero be a turncoat who was not only an interesting narrative opportunity, it was also done out of a sense of expediency. The whole concept and rationale behind this were that we didn't necessarily have the time and resources to flesh out pure Templar gameplay that would make sense, as Azia says. These things like manipulating the crowd and not being able to do parkour, we decided that the character would be a former assassin who was starting to turn to the Templars and was hunting his former colleagues down. As always, the character emerged from the story and time period, but the team had some specific inspirations in mind when creating Shay. Liam Neeson in Taken was a huge inspiration in terms of his character and his personality. He's very headstrong in that film, Lozanov says. In terms of his visual appearance and posture, we were inspired by Mads Mikkelsen. I love that actor, he's so human. With hindsight, Lozanov says it's clear that he put a lot of himself into Shay. I guess we included a lot of our personalities into Shay, Lozanov admits. Whether it was personal stories of things that happened in our lives that made us who we were. All the failures, all the disappointments, all the things that we admired in other people. I think all these things were collected in Shay somehow. When I look back, maybe this was the greatest inspiration. At the time, we never realized that Shay had so many of our personal traits. The mixture of Assassin and Templar was also conveyed through the gameplay mechanics available to Shay. For the team, it was important to contrast the latter to the Assassins. We know that the Assassins believe in free will. They act from the shadows, so have the hidden blade, Lozanov explains. They kill people, which is not very nice, but they have their reasons. Meanwhile, the Templars are more about control. They want to create this golden age cage for people. They want citizens to believe that everything is fine, but the people are actually being constrained. We wanted to reflect the different philosophies of the Templars into our character of Shay, and in his outfit when he transforms. He has his gun, which he can use to manipulate the crowd. He can create commotion and confusion with bombs. He can achieve his goals by silently eliminating and manipulating the guards with misdirection. This is like an extension of the Templar philosophies of control and order. This contrast wasn't just limited to gameplay mechanics. While Shay still had some of the aesthetic common to the Assassins, his outfit was very different to what we were used to, thanks to his shift in allegiances. He has kept his hood on from the Assassins so that he can remain hidden, Lozanov says, but there is a clear transition with his outfit. The Assassin traditionally had a lighter tone to their clothing, whereas Shay dresses in a much stricter, formalized, militaristic fashion that includes the black coat of the Templar Order. Azazia adds, Assassins are generally super slick and inspired by an eagle. We wanted the Templars to contrast that. If you look at Shay with his high-collared jacket, he looks like a fortress. It's designed to be square and grounded. The contrast also carried over to his ship, the Morgan. The sailing ship of Black Flag, helmed by Edward Kenway, was a large vessel that preferred fighting from a distance in cannon battles. Shay's vessel, by contrast, was smaller but capable of much more brute force. Alongside a change in the faction of the playable character, the setting dictated that naval gameplay needed to evolve as well. Rogue was set in an iceberg-heavy parts of the Arctic Ocean, as well as North America, which was a far cry from the tropical Caribbean of Black Flag. We had to adapt the naval conflict to a northern sea, where we had icebergs and ice sheets that you can break, Woznov explains. Naturally, we used them to create challenges or obstacles for the player to tackle. You can use icebergs as a shield or to break line of sight and escape, if you want to. We had to adapt the ships to this new environment, and added the battle ram, a new addition to the ship. The smaller ship can use the battle ram for more precise tactics. It was an evolution and an expansion of Black Flag. We needed to evolve this ship with a few additions, which of course were a reflection of what the Templars were doing in terms of manipulation and control. So we had the battle ram, which you can use to break ice. As a Templar, you break, you manipulate, and divide and conquer is your metaphor. He continues, I strongly believe that when you establish a vision or idea for a game, or any creative work, it should be seen in every single detail of the game itself. If we established a position that we wanted to portray in the Templar philosophy, then every single thing in the game should have been reflected through the prism of that vision and expose some element of it. Rogue was created in a short amount of time, too. The first pitch meetings took place in the autumn of 2013, around the launch of Black Flag. The final game launched in November 2014. This was in part because the title was built on tools that the team had been using for years and which they had a tight handle on. We were so competent with the tools that we went from nothing to being an alpha in an extremely quick time, Luhi remembers. We had a lot of time to actually polish and make that game as good as it could possibly be. We almost surprised ourselves with how early we had hit alpha and beta stages. That allowed us to do a lot of player tests, look at where the pain points were, and push the tech as far as it could go. He continues, when the tools are there, and you have the team that can do it, it could be done that quickly. Yes, the high-level story would have been done before then. There would have been stuff that had been in the works for probably the year before we started production. It was a real team effort to get it done within 9 to 12 months for sure. The release of Rogue marked the end of the Kenway saga, but the effects of the game would be felt in the future of the franchise. Not least because one of Shay's victims was a Parisian assassin by the name of Charles Dorian. This might have been the end of the Kenway dynasty, but it was the beginning of the next chapter in Assassin's Creed. Now here it says the Jackdaw ship at San Diego Comic-Con. Golden Age pirates were brought back to life at San Diego Comic-Con in 2013 with Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag and the Jackdaw. Making a splash at San Diego Comic-Con was no easy feat, but the Ubisoft events team set a new high-water mark by commissioning the Star of India, the world's oldest active sailing ship, to recreate Edward Kenway's trusty old brig, the Jackdaw. Months of production, historical research, casting, and negotiations with local officials culminated in a week of unforgettable experiences for fans, press, and content creators alike. On board, fans were treated to exclusive gameplay demos, sea shanties, historically accurate artifacts, comic book signings, and other activities. It was truly the ultimate Assassin's Creed experience. And then right over here, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag Freedom Cry. In the wake of Black Flag, Ubisoft Quebec released a standalone piece of content called Freedom Cry. Where Assassin's Creed 3 and Black Flag had shied away from the topic of slavery in America and the Caribbean, Freedom Cry drove straight in. As with every Assassin's Creed game, the key is authenticity, art director Thierry Denissereau explains. Working with historians, doing research, and knowing what we're about to depict is vitally important to reproducing the time and place in a respectful and accurate manner. That's the key here. We try to create a world that depicts the time period and location we are exploring, without censoring it through a modern lens. It's up to the player to decide what's good or bad. We're not trying to promote personal opinions, politics, or push an agenda when making Assassin's Creed. We are trying to give the players an accurate depiction of the historical realities of that time period, and then it's up to the player to decide how they want to engage with that world and formulate their own opinions. The title stars Adewalde, previously seen as Edward Kenway's quartermaster in Black Flag. He was the first black assassin to star in the franchise. His design was inspired by his previous life as an enslaved person, having been born into bondage in Trinidad. We fully embraced the grittier aspects of this character, Denissereau says. We even gave him a machete, as an acknowledgement of the enslaved people who would have had to use that to cut sugarcane. The name itself, Freedom Cry, was derived from the time period and came to Denissereau via, of all places, reggae culture. There's a dancehall singer called Sizzla who did an album called Freedom Cry, he explains. The name resonated well with the game. It refers to these chants the enslaved people used to sing in the field to carry messages. The white guards couldn't catch the subtleties of what they were saying. They thought they were just singing, but in fact they were communicating among one another. And folks, that is the end of Chapter 3. Join us next time as we dive right into Chapter 4, The Age of Revolution. Thanks for watching. Bye.